They laughed when she arrived in an Uber. They mocked her for taking the bus. They assumed her simple clothes meant she had failed. But Helena stayed quiet because she knew something they didn't. Her company was worth nearly $2 billion. Her software had won a massive government contract, and the old watch on her wrist, it was a priceless piece, once owned by a legendary billionaire who had secretly mentored her. One careless insult at dinner pushed the truth into the open, and within minutes, every person who had judged Helena was forced to look at her differently. But Helena's real lesson was even sharper. Wealth means nothing if it only changes how people treat you.
My name is Chloe, I'm 29, and my biotech company is worth 8 figures. But you'd never know it. I live in a tiny apartment in Somerville, and I choose hoodies over designer dresses. My family doesn't get it. At our big family dinners, my cousins are covered in brand names while I show up in jeans. At our last get-together, that all changed. My cousin Ethan joked about my worn-out messenger bag. When I opened it, my dad saw the old notebook inside, and his whole expression shifted. If you're new here, tell me your city in the comments. And subscribe to see how an old, tattered notebook finally put my rich family in their place. Being a Thompson meant prep schools and summers on Martha's Vineyard sounds great, right? Right? My dad, Robert, is a Boston venture capital legend who built his firm from the ground up. My mom, Catherine, comes from an old Boston family whose name is carved into library walls. They gave me every advantage, but always said I had to forge my own path. My cousins were happy to live on the family trust, but I had to build something that was mine and mine alone. So after I graduated from MIT, I did the one thing my family never expected. I turned down a cushy analyst job at my dad's investment firm. I took a low-paying lab assistant role at a tiny biotech startup instead. My dad was confused, but he supported me. My mom was horrified. She thought I was throwing away my education. And my cousins, especially Ethan, said I was insane. "You could have an office with a view of the harbor," Ethan sneered. "Instead, you're washing test tubes for scientists who'll be bankrupt next year." I just said, "Some things are worth more than a nice view." He just looked at me like I was speaking another language. But that tiny startup was perfect. It was scrappy, ethical, and filled with the brightest people I'd ever met. I poured everything into it, and within 2 years, I was leading their lead research team. That's where I met Leo. He was a celebrated geneticist in his late 60s, consulting with us. He became the mentor I was so desperate for. My dad taught me about markets and capital, but Leo taught me how to actually build something that could save lives. He was a quiet genius who had no patience for academic politics. The man drove a 20-year-old Volvo, wore the same tweed jacket every day, and lived in a small place in Cambridge. But he had pioneered 2 revolutionary gene therapies from scratch. "Real science is quiet," he told me once. "The moment you have to issue a press release about it, it stops being real." That always stuck with me. When a pharma giant bought our startup 2 years later, I used my payout to launch my own company, Viridian Solutions. Leo was my very first investor. Those first years were brutal. I worked out of a rented lab, putting every single dime back into the research. My company's mission was to create affordable gene therapies for rare childhood diseases. The goal was noble, but the start was a nightmare-fatal trials, contaminated ensamples, and we nearly went under twice. But Leo was my rock. When the venture capitalists got anxious, he stayed calm. When my own resolve crumbled, he reminded me of our mission. Whenever I was about to quit, he would show up with coffee and tell me stories of his own biggest failures. Then, on my 27th birthday, after we got a huge grant, Leo gave me a gift. "This old thing got me through 2 failed labs and a nasty patent war," he said, handing me a tattered, coffee-stained notebook. "Now it's yours." It looked like trash, pages yellowed and falling apart. But this was the notebook, the legendary one he used to sketch out the formulas that changed modern medicine. I'd only ever seen it in textbooks. "Leo, I can't take this," I whispered. He just smiled. "That book is worth more than your company. I was stunned. For now, he said, placing it in my bag. But not for long. Keep it so you remember your own worth, not just your valuation. A few months later, Leo passed away from a sudden heart attack. I was completely broken. That notebook became my most prized possession, not for its value, but because it was the last thing I had of him. I kept it on my desk as I led the company through a period of explosive growth, all by myself. In the years that followed, Viridian Solutions became a biotech powerhouse. We were published in major journals. We opened a lab in Zurich, and I made the Forbes 30 under 30 list. But I never forgot Leo's lesson. I stayed in my small apartment and kept my life simple. I kept driving my old Subaru and skipped the fancy industry galas. My family had absolutely no idea how successful my company had become. To them, I was just playing around in some little lab. I would just sit through these family dinners, listening to my cousins brag about their ski chalets and exotic cars. My parents never asked much, but I knew Dad was reading the biotech news about my work, and I could tell he was quietly proud. The annual Thompson family dinner is a huge affair, hosted by my dad and his brother, my Uncle Richard. It's always held at my parents' massive Beacon Hill mansion, a place that's been in architecture magazines. The entire family gathers to drink, eat, and subtly compete over who has the newest, most expensive toy. My Uncle Richard has always been resentful of my dad's success. My dad built his firm on smart risks and hard work. Uncle Richard married a wealthy woman and got a cushy job from her father. Their kids are exactly the same. My cousins, Ethan in particular, think a person's value is based on their car's price tag. These dinners felt more like a luxury showcase than a family meal. As I got ready, that old familiar anxiety started to creep in, so as I imagined what Leo would say. I could almost hear his dry chuckle. Let them show off their trinkets. You're building a legacy. That's all I needed to hear. I put on my usual uniform, jeans, a simple sweater, and grabbed my messenger bag with Leo's notebook inside. I called a lift to the mansion and braced myself for the night. "Sam's house," the driver muttered as we pulled onto the cobblestone street. I just nodded, watching the gaslights flicker on the historic brownstones. Coming home was always so strange. I loved my parents, but I couldn't stand all the pretense. "The main entrance is fine," I told him. As we pulled up, I saw the fleet of luxury cars parked out front. And, of course, there was Ethan's new Rivian, parked at the very front so nobody could possibly miss it. Beside it was Uncle Richard's Jaguar and my cousin Olivia's brand new Range Rover, the usual suspects. My lift, a simple Camry, felt totally out of place pulling up to the massive front doors. I thanked the driver and stepped out into the cool night air. I saw a curtain move in the window. I was sure it was Ethan, laughing at my ride. Before I could even ring the bell, the heavy door swung open. It was Marco, the family's butler. His formal expression dissolved into a warm, genuine smile. "Miss Chloe, it is so good to see you. Your parents are in the drawing room with the family," he told me. "Thanks, Marco," I smiled back. "How is your son, Daniel?" "He's doing wonderfully. He just started his PhD program at Johns Hopkins, the first in our family to go to graduate school." "That is amazing," I said, genuinely thrilled. I had helped Daniel with his research papers for his application. "He loves it," Marco said. "He tells everyone, you're the reason he got in." I squeezed his arm, walked through the grand foyer, heard the chatter, and took a deep breath before walking in. My mother saw me first. Catherine Thompson was a vision in her 60s, elegant and perfect, in a dress that cost more than my rent for a year. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her presence undeniable. She left my aunt and glided towards me. "Chloe, darling," she said, kissing the air next to my cheek. Then her eyes did that familiar sweep, taking in my simple clothes. "You know that scent. John's suit I bought you would have been lovely for this evening." "I'm just more comfortable in this, Mom," I replied, giving her a proper hug. She returned the hug, but she felt a little rigid. "Well, you made it," she said, letting out a little sigh. "Come, Your cousin Ethan just landed a massive account for his father's firm. Of course he had. Ethan's victories were always front-page news, while mine were never even mentioned. I followed her into the drawing room, a huge space filled with family members overlooking the garden. My dad was by the fireplace talking to Uncle Richard, but his head snapped up the second I walked in. My father, Robert Thompson, was tall and imposing, his dark hair now mostly silver. Unlike my mom, who thrived in the luxury their fortune provided, Dad always looked a little uncomfortable in it all. He owned the fancy suits and the historic mansion. But at these large parties, you could still see the scrappy kid from South Boston hiding in there. "There's my girl," he said, walking away from his brother to give me a proper hug. It was warm and smelled of his usual cedar aftershave. "How was the trip over?" "Not too bad," I said. He looked at me closely. "You look tired," still burning the candle at both ends. "A little," I admitted, "but things are finally paying off." "I'll say," he said in a low voice, "I saw the preliminary data from your phase 2 trial. It's a miracle, Chloe." "Absolutely revolutionary." I was shocked. "You saw that?" He offered a small, proud smile. "I always keep up with you, even if you don't think I am." He gave my shoulder a squeeze. "I'm so proud of you, Chloe. You're doing it on your own terms." Before I could even respond, Uncle Richard glided over with a drink. "Chloe! Good of you to finally join us. We thought you'd forgotten us little people." His laugh was loud, but his smile was completely fake. "Hello, Uncle Marcus," I said, giving him a quick hug. "How are things at Apex Global?" "Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. We just acquired a robotics firm in Seattle, adding a cool $2 billion to our portfolio." He swirled the scotch in his tumbler. "But enough about work. How's that little passion project of yours?" "Still scraping by?" My dad gave him a sharp look, but I managed a smile. "We're doing just fine." "Thanks. Good, good. Grit is important," he said, patting my shoulder with that familiar condescending air. "Ethan's over there. He just made vice president youngest in the company's history." "That's wonderful," I said, my voice dripping with false sincerity. "I'll be sure to congratulate him." And just like that, Ethan appeared at his father's elbow. My cousin was 32, with the kind of manufactured good looks that came from a team of stylists. His suit was impossibly sharp, his watch a constellation of diamonds. "Cousin Chloe," he said, kissing the air near my cheek. Love the understated look. "So very authentic." "Ethan," I replied, my tone flat. "Heard about the promotion. Congrats." He straightened his silk tie. "Thanks." The new Ferrari in the driveway was a little bonus for myself. 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. "Amazing," I said, feeling absolutely nothing. David's old, simple watch on my wrist suddenly felt heavier, an anchor to what actually mattered. My cousin Olivia drifted over, her stilettos clicking on the marble. "Chloe, darling, it's been an age." She enveloped me in a fog of designer perfume and champagne. "Your hair is so effortless." "I adore it." Olivia was Ethan's youngest sister, 26, and already on her second millionaire husband. Her job as a lifestyle influencer mostly involved attending parties and posting about them online. "Thanks, Olivia. You look stunning." "We just got back from St. Bart's," she said, flicking her perfectly styled hair. "Antoine keeps a yacht there. It's simply to die for. It has 6 cabins, a hot tub on the deck, and a private chef." She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "We're thinking of picking up a small place in Malibu. Nothing crazy, just a simple $5 million cottage on the beach." I just nodded as she went on and on. The room was a symphony of boasts. My cousin was showing off a new Patek Philippe watch, while his sister scrolled through photos from their trip to the Maldives. My aunt was complaining to my mom about the stress of renovating Zayersko's in Aspen. The entire room was buzzing with talk of acquisitions and stock options, the relentless game of who had more. I just stood there, feeling the weight of David's watch, my thought on our meeting tomorrow. We were coordinating with a non-profit to use our platform to install solar panels for low-income communities. The disconnect was jarring, like I was toggling between two completely different planets. A waiter announced that dinner was served, and relief washed over me. As we all started moving to the dining room, my father came up beside me. "You've been awfully quiet tonight," he said. "Just tired," I lied. "It's the end of our fiscal year. Everything's chaotic." He nodded, then dropped his voice. "I saw that article about your company, offering your tech to those nonprofits for free. That was a very honorable thing to do." I glanced at him, surprised. He hardly ever mentioned the specifics of my work. "It just felt like the right thing to," I said. For a second, his eyes were filled with real pride. "Your grandfather would have been proud. He never forgot where he came from." He paused. "And neither have I, whatever Marcus might think." We walked into the dining room, where a table for 24 gleamed under a massive crystal chandelier. Ornate place cards confirmed my fate. I was wedged between Ethan and his wife Isabel. The family's dinner theater had officially begun. The first course appeared immediately, Delftste biscuit in fine china. Wine was poured and the show started. These dinners always followed the same script. Accomplishments were casually woven into the conversation. Big-ticket purchases were mentioned offhandedly. A silent war for status was waged with every single comment. "Isabel, that bracelet is just exquisite," my aunt called out from down the table. "Is it new?" Isabel held up her wrist, flashing the diamonds. "Oh, this? Yes. Ethan got it for me when he closed that robotics deal. It's a custom Cartier piece. It's gorgeous," my mother said. Speaking of deals, Marcus, I heard Apex is circling that company in Seattle." My uncle dabbed his lips with a linen napkin. "We're in the final stages." Ethan was really the one who spearheaded the whole thing. All heads turned to Ethan, who performed his part perfectly, feigning modesty. I just helped push it over the line. "But it should boost our profits by 30%. We're looking at Asia next," Uncle Marcus added. "Ethan always had an instinct for a good investment. He gets that from my side of the family." My father just raised an eyebrow and took a sip of wine. I knew he was remembering how Marcus nearly bankrupted his first business before marrying into wealth. "And Liam, darling, how's the new job?" my mother asked, changing the subject. Liam puffed up his chest. "So challenging, but rewarding. We just signed a $1 billion contract. I'm taking the company jet to Dubai next week." The one-upmanship continued as the next course was served. A seared ahi tuna salad with microgreens. I kept my eyes on my plate, trying to become invisible, only speaking when someone asked me a question. But Ethan was determined to shine a spotlight on me. "So Chloe," he started, swirling his wine. "How's life in the tech world? Still crammed into that little co-working space downtown?" "We got our own office last year, actually," I replied quietly. "It's closer to the financial district." "Oh, the financial district? That's pricey. The overhead must be a nightmare," he said. I just shrugged. "We make it work." "And the company?" he pushed. "Still just you and a few coders?" "We're expanding." Ethan shot his father a little knowing smile. "Look, startups are a gamble. Most of them go under. The fact you're still afloat is frankly kind of amazing." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I said, my voice flat. Aunt Catherine leaned towards me, her face a perfect picture of fake concern. "Honey, if it ever gets to be too much, you know your family is here. There's no shame in admitting defeat. I'm sure your father could find a place for you at his firm." A hot flash of anger shot through me, but I kept my cool. "That's kind of you, Aunt Catherine. But we're doing very well." "Of course you are, dear," she said, patting my hand like I was 5 years old. "I just worry. A bright girl like you should think about stability. Look at Isabel. She and Ethan just bought that stunning penthouse on the waterfront." Isabel beamed. "The renovation is costing a fortune, but it's a fantastic investment." We're adding a screening room and a private yoga studio. You have to come see it when it's done, Chloe. It might give you some ideas. I forced a tight smile. Sounds incredible. You know, Uncle Marcus added, going it alone is admirable, but the corporate ladder offers real security. I knew a man who tried the startup route. Smartest guy you'd ever meet. Brilliant idea. Sank every penny he had into it. You know what he does today? He's the district manager for a chain of self-storage facilities. A few relatives nodded gravely at this cautionary tale. I recall your first business plan, Ethan said, slicing into his steak as the main course was served. It was an app for, what was it? Tracking solar panels or something? Something like that, I said, taking a sip of water. Seems like a pretty small market, he said. Little eco companies don't have deep pockets. Now, if you were selling to the big energy corporations, he trailed off, giving a slight shake of his head. We have a diverse portfolio of clients, I said, keeping my answer short. But Marcus wouldn't let it go. I'm just worried about you, is all. In this economy, the venture capital market debt is completely frozen. I thought about the $50 million investment round we closed last month and the 2 acquisition offers sitting in my inbox. We're fine. My father cleared his throat. Close Clues Company is doing more than fine. In fact, their year-over-year growth is astounding. Marcus seemed genuinely surprised for a second, but the smug look returned almost instantly. Well, isn't that nice? It's great to follow your passion, even if you have to live frugally to do it. Isabel, Ethan's wife, pounced on her father-in-law's condescending line. Exactly, Chloe. I think it's so brave of you to embrace a simpler life. It must feel so authentic, living like a normal person. I could feel my father watching me, his face a blank mask. My mother looked anxious, caught between wanting to defend me and wanting to keep the peace. I replied evenly that there is dignity in building something with your own 2 hands. It was something David always said. David? Uncle Marcus asked. David Chen, I clarified. My mentor. He passed away last year. Oh, that strange recluse, Marcus sneered. I read his obituary. Made a fortune in early software, then just fell off the map. What a character. Hearing Elias discussed like that made my jaw tighten, but I kept my mouth shut. He believed your real worth was in the change you made, not your bank balance. Mark scoffed. Easy for him to say, sitting on a massive fortune. I bet he had a private jet and penthouses everywhere. Actually, he flew commercial and had 1 small house in Santa Fe, I corrected him. He funneled almost everything into his foundation for young artists. Well, to each his own, Mark shrugged. But I don't see anything wrong with enjoying your success. Life is short, you know. What's the point of winning if you can't have a victory lap? As they planned Mark S. girlfriend's next trip to Monaco, I felt the cool, familiar weight of Elias' gift in my pocket. I thought about his quiet intensity, his genuine curiosity in people, and his belief that success was about creating, not consuming. The gap between his world and this one felt like a canyon. My thoughts were broken by my cousin Tiffany showing off her new custom Range Rover. The seats are all hand-stitched. It took 8 months. But when you're driving around Greenwich, you need to project a certain image. Mark nodded, dead serious. Image is everything. The right watch, the right address, the right friends. It tells the world which team you play for. He then turned to me, a smug smile spreading across his face. Speaking of which, Clara, I saw you showed up in an Uber. Still taking the subway everywhere? A quiet hush fell over the dinner table as every single head swiveled my way. His question was just dripping with condescension. I saw my mother estrained smile, my aunt's pity, and my uncle's pride in his son's cheap jab. But it was my father's reaction that truly threw me. He wasn't looking at Mark. He was staring at my hand, where I placed Elias's sculpture beside my plate. His eyes were wide, his fork hovering in midair. He was looking at it with total disbelief. Mark, thinking my dad was just embarrassed for me, decided to twist the knife. I mean, there's being smart with your money, and then there's just making your own life difficult. The subway is a nightmare, and you never know what kind of weirdos you'll have to sit next to. I opened my mouth to fire back, but my father spoke first. Is that what I think it is? He asked, his voice sharp, cutting right through Mark's smarmy little monologue. He was still staring at the sculpture, and his intense focus drew everyone's attention with him. I glanced down at Elias's gift, suddenly feeling like I was pinned under a spotlight. What do you mean? The sculpture, he said, putting down his fork with a sharp clink. Let me see it. The table was now perfectly still. Mark just looked bewildered by this strange and sudden turn of events. I hesitated for a moment, then slid the small bronze piece across the table. My father leaned forward, his eyes full of awe as he examined it. This is an Elias Vance original, he said, his voice barely a whisper. From his first and only Foundation series. Uncle Robert scowled. The sculptor who died last year. He made those lumpy things? Before he ever sold a single piece, my father explained, still turning it in his hands. He was a master craftsman. He made a few of these himself before his first gallery show ever took off. Only 10 were ever made. He looked up at me, his face a mixture of shock and a dawning brand new respect. How in the world did you get this? Mark's mocking words now felt like a bad joke just hanging there in the air. Elias gave it to me, I said simply. He was my mentor, and he believed in my company when nobody else did. My father leaned back in his chair, looking totally floored. Do you have any idea what this little thing is worth? I nodded. I know it's valuable, but that is not why I carry it. That, my father announced to the entire table, is a $3 million sculpture. Probably more, now that he's gone and considering how rare it is. You could have heard a pin drop. Mark's jaw literally fell open. His girlfriend's wine glass clattered against her plate. Aunt Carol started choking on her water. Oh, this old thing? I said with a little shrug. Picking it up, I keep it on my desk. Elias always said art was meant to be lived with, not locked away in a vault. My brother Mark was holding court at dinner, bragging about a recent art auction. A piece by Elias Vance, he declared, a tiny bronze, sold for $3 million. He then gestured to my mantelpiece. Speaking of art, what is that lumpy thing, Clara? My mother Eleanor winced. I smiled calmly. That is also an Elias Vance. Mark choked on his wine. $3 million? For that? Is it insured? It is, I told them. Elias gave it to me himself. He says it was the first sculpture that truly captured the feeling he was chasing. Mark was speechless. His condescending attitude completely evaporated. You actually knew Elias Vance? Mark stammered. The man was a complete legend. He was more than that, I said quietly. He was my friend. He championed my work when almost no one else would. So what is it you do exactly? My mother asked. All her earlier judgment had disappeared, replaced by genuine curiosity. You're always so mysterious about your projects. I took a breath. Elias always said you have to own your own story. My company develops biodegradable plastics from sea algae, I told her. We're replacing single-use plastics in packaging, starting with local businesses and now expanding globally. We now have partnerships with several major food distributors, a few global nonprofits, and even the government's Agricultural Security Division. My mother stared at me. Agricultural security. You never mentioned that. The contract was signed last month, I said. We're rolling out our system to help protect the national food supply this year. It is the biggest deal in our company's history. How big? Mark asked, his envy now mixed with total awe. I looked him straight in the eye. It's $800 million over the next 5 years. Another wave of stuns rolled across the dining room. My father was practically glowing with pride. My mother just looked confused. But you still live in that tiny downtown apartment? She asked, her voice full of complete bewilderment. And you still take the bus? I just smiled. I like my apartment. It's close to my office, and it's right next to my favorite park for running. As for the bus, it's practical, and it's much better for the environment. Elias rode his bicycle to work every single day, even after his company went public. A true Vance disciple, my father murmured, looking at me with a whole new kind of admiration. Mark was trying to process all of it, struggling to make this new information fit his picture of me. So your startup is like a legitimate business? I nodded. It is. We were valued at nearly $2 billion after our last round of funding, and I am still the majority owner. Uncle Robert nearly choked on his dinner roll, and Aunt Carol's eyes were as wide as saucers. Mark's girlfriend was typing furiously on her phone, no doubt searching from my company online. "You're a billionaire?" Mark asked, his voice cracking just a little bit. "On paper, maybe," I clarified. "Most of my net worth is just company stock. I pay myself a normal salary, and I live a pretty simple life." "But why would you hide all that?" Tiffany asked, completely mystified. "If I had that kind of money, everyone would know it." I thought of Elias, of his quiet humility, and how he never felt any need to impress other people. Real success isn't about what people think of you. It's about what you create and the problems you solve. Our tech has helped thousands of farms from going under. It's helped deliver drought assistance to regions that were being devastated. That's worth more to me than any number in a bank account. My father nodded slowly. That was Elias's whole philosophy. It is about the work, not the credit. I always admired that about him. Mark just sat there, completely unable to process it. His whole reality, where I was at the very bottom of the family ladder, had just been completely shattered in under 10 minutes. "But your clothes, your apartment, their choices," I said, finishing his sentence. "And just like your choices, my choices reflect my values. Elias taught me that you show people who you are by what you do, not by what you own." The dinner continued, but the entire atmosphere at the table had shifted. Aunts and uncles, who had barely looked at me, were now desperate to hear everything I had to say. The questions came flying at me about my work, my friend Elias, and my plans for the company. I just stayed calm, refusing to brag or play into their new obsession with me. When dessert came, Mark leaned over to me, his voice a low whisper. "Clara, I am so sorry. I've been a complete jerk. I just assumed that because you never showed off, you must not have anything to show." I looked at him for a moment, seeing past the expensive watch and the arrogance to the huge insecurity that was underneath it all. Success isn't one size fits all, Mark. I don't judge you for how you live your life. I'd just appreciate it if you would give me the same respect. He nodded, looking genuinely humbled for once. "That sculpture," he said. "It's really incredible. Elias Vance must have really believed in you." I glanced down at the sculpture on the table. It is a reminder of what's actually important. Not how much it cost, but what it stands for. Vision, passion, and building something that actually matters. As I said that, I saw my father watching me from across the table with a strange, thoughtful look. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing his daughter who needed his protection. He was seeing a woman who had built her own world on her own terms. In that one look, I knew something between us had changed forever. Something was shifting in the room. This old book in my hands, Arthur Finch's own copy, was telling a story about me that I never had. It revealed secrets I kept quiet, not out of shame, but because I wanted to be judged for who I am, not what I'm worth. As dinner wound down, I was grateful for its weight, a tie to the man who shaped not just my work, but my entire life. Once dessert was cleared, the conversation turned back to the book and its famous owner. My Uncle Robert, quiet until now, voiced what everyone was wondering. "I just want to see how Arthur Finch was your mentor," he said, looking at his wine. The man was famously guarded with his time and his money. "So how did you two ever cross paths?" Every head at the table turned my way. The waitstaff even paused, sensing a story was about to unfold. My own father leaned forward, curious. I met Arthur at a tiny biotech firm called Chromagene just after I got my doctorate. He was a special advisor, a last-ditch hire to stop the company from going under. Our investors had pulled out, and our lead genetic trial had just spectacularly failed. I remember them, my cousin Leo chimed in. Didn't some massive pharmaceutical company acquire them? I nodded. For almost $2 billion. But back then, we were about to lay off everyone. Arthur came in and just tore our entire research and development process apart. He had this incredible focus, a crazy ability to pinpoint the one fatal flaw that was killing the science. That was his genius, my father said. I saw him give a talk at a conference. The way he thought was just on a different level. He found me in the lab, questioning basic principles the senior scientists had taken for granted. I continued. After a very tense board meeting, he asked me to get coffee. We sat there and talked for 4 hours. Before we left, he offered to be my mentor. Just like that, my Uncle Robert asked, his voice full of disbelief. Arthur always made big bets on people, I explained. He told me years later that he saw his own stubborn streak in me, that I was attacking problems from an angle no one else had thought of. My mother, who was listening quietly, finally chimed in. And he's the one who gave you the funding for your own company, right? When you started Bioform. He was my first and only angel investor, I said. He wrote a check for $500,000 after one conversation. No pitch deck, no 5-year forecast. He said he was investing in me, not in an idea. That is a foolish way to do business, Uncle Robert grumbled, clearly annoyed by the lack of protocol. I smiled. Arthur was never a conventional man. He knew real progress is built on trust and guts, not on committees and spreadsheets. He gave me the check and said, "Go build something that fixes a real problem." His only rules were that I never give up a controlling stake in the company and that I use a portion of the profits to help others. The foundation you run, my father said, a new light in his eyes. The one that funds STEM education in poor communities. That was part of your deal with Finch. Yes, I said, surprised he knew, though I would have done it anyway. Arthur believed that real success comes with real responsibility. My cousin Maya, who'd been buried in her phone, gasped, "No way." Forbes just reported Bioform has a projected valuation of over $5 billion. They're talking about a possible IPO next year. She looked up at me, stunned. You named the entire company after his core philosophy. It seemed fitting, I said softly. His values are the foundation of everything we're trying to build. But why keep it all a secret? My Aunt Claire asked, looking at my simple store-bought dress. You could be living in a skyscraper, driving a Ferrari, wearing designer everything. I tried to find the words to explain a mindset so different from theirs. When Arthur gave me this book, he said something that stuck with me forever. He said, "The second your success becomes a performance for other people, you have already failed. I don't need the applause to know the work matters." My father nodded, a look of deep respect finally on his face. Finch always said that true strength is knowing your own worth without needing anyone else to validate it. It's why even his biggest rivals respected him. Exactly, I said. And he lived that way every single day. The most important things he taught me weren't about raising money or building a team. They were about integrity, about having a mission, and about the duty you have when you're in a position to actually help. Leo, who had been listening, spoke up. So that book, it is more than just a rare addition to you, isn't it? It's priceless, I told him. Arthur was holding this very book when he heard his first life-saving patent had been approved. He said it was his reminder of the incredible patience required to create something that truly endures. My dad smiled. And now you carry it while you're building your own legacy. I had to disagree. It's not a legacy, Dad. It's a tool. Our work is creating biomaterials that will save people's lives. The money is just a consequence of that. It was never the goal. My uncle still seemed unconvinced, but my father nodded, as if truly seeing me for the first time. I felt his whole opinion of me shift, a blend of pride and maybe some regret. That grant from the National Institutes of Health, he gasped. The one for developing advanced new skin grafts for burn victims. Yes, I confirmed. We won that against some of the largest medical tech companies in the world. Our new cellular matrix should completely change how severe burns are treated. That was your company. My Uncle Henry sputtered. I saw that on the news. They never said your name. I prefer to stay out of the spotlight, I said. The work should get the headlines. But surely now, Aunt Patricia added, you'll buy a bigger house? Or at least a new car. I just gave a small, polite smile. I'm quite happy with what I have. My house is practical. It's what I need. I've lived in the same simple home for over a decade, long after the company became profitable. My grandmother taught me that owning more things just means you have more things to worry about. So you just work all the time? My sister Megan asked. Her tone colored with what I think was pity. I work on things I'm passionate about. I corrected her gently. But I also travel, I volunteer at a clinic, and I have amazing friends who couldn't care less about my bank account. My life is very, very full. And the foundation? My dad asked. Tell them about that. A genuine smile finally broke through. Now this I loved talking about. The Finch Institute for Scientific Advancement. We give full-ride scholarships and one-on-one mentorship to kids from underserved school districts. It covers everything: tuition, housing, a new laptop, paid research internships, and job placement help. Our first group of 40 students are all starting their senior year of college. They are going to change the world. 40 students? My Uncle Ben cut in, sounding unimpressed. That's a drop in the ocean for someone with your kind of money. It's a pilot program, I said, keeping my voice even. We want to prove the model works before we scale it up. The goal is to be funding 15,000 students a year by 2030. 10,000 lives, my father used to say. Now that's a serious return on an investment, better than any stock. I never forgot that. Julian always said his real legacy wasn't just patents, but the people he helped and the chances he created. As the family moved into the living room after coffee, I could feel the air change. The way they looked at me was different, heavier somehow. Like they were all trying to figure out where I fit in now. It was the one thing I'd always tried to avoid, being measured by my net worth instead of my character. My brother Mark cornered me in the hall, right by the dusty portraits of our ancestors. I feel like I have to completely rethink who you are, he said. For years, I honestly felt bad for you, thinking you were barely getting by. And now I find out you could buy this entire neighborhood and not even notice. I stopped and looked him right in the eye. That's exactly why I never talk about money, Mark. I didn't want it to change how you see me. It's the least interesting part of my life. He just stared, totally confused. But isn't that the whole point? Getting the credit you deserve. The only credit I need is seeing our skin grafts help a firefighter go back to work, I told him. Or seeing a kid from our program get their PhD. That's what Arthur would have been proud of. Leo glanced down at the old book in my hand, then back up at my face. I think I could learn a thing or two from you, cuz. And for the first time all night, he sounded like he really meant it. We were in the studies now, a traditional space with dark wood, leather chairs, and shelves packed with books. The family was in small groups, and for the first time, I was at the center of the conversations instead of on the fringe. Uncle Michaels was suddenly grilling me on robotics investments. Aunt Susan was desperate to set me up with a friend who ran a venture capital firm. Even my cousin Mark, who usually just nods in my direction, was asking about my company's 5-year expansion plan. I grabbed a glass of bourbon and ducked into a quiet alcove to think. The news had turned everyone into caricatures of themselves, which was both hilarious and deeply strange. I was still the woman who'd pulled up in a beat-up hatchback. But they were all seeing someone new. Quite the splash you're making, my father said, appearing at my side with a drink of his own. Can I hide in here with you for a minute? I motioned to the chair across from me. Please do. He sat taking a slow sip of his scotch. You know, I always admired that independent streak of yours, building your own career. But I had no idea this was it. Would you have done anything different if you'd known? I asked. He considered it for a moment. I've always been proud of you, Chloe. But I might have been a bit faster to shut down some of the family's more patronizing remarks. I can handle patronizing, I told him. It's this sudden whiplash, now that they know what the company is worth, that's so hard to stomach. My dad nodded. He got it. Big success puts a target on your back. It's why I never brag after a record-breaking sales quarter. Arthur used to say the same thing, I mentioned. He said the friends he had before he got rich could all fit into his first beat-up car. Sounds like a brilliant mentor. My dad swirled the whiskey in his glass. I wish I'd met him. I'd see him at charity events, but we never had a real conversation. The two of you would have clicked, I said. All that brilliance but not a shred of ego. He was the genuine article. Takes one to know one, my father said, offering me a rare, unguarded smile. You know, watching you navigate this room tonight, it reminds me of me, back at your age. That same drive to create something tangible, to be respected for your work, not just your family name. That really took me by surprise. My dad always seemed so comfortable in his world of old money and the privilege that came with it. Really? I thought you loved all this. I gestured to the lavish, over-the-top gala. He let out a soft laugh. Your mother adores it. I go along because it makes her happy. Honestly, I'm happier on my boat. He leaned in a little. Why do you think I'm always at the office? Or hiding out at that fishing cabin? All this? He waved his hand around the room. This was never my why. Never knew, I confessed. I guess we're both better at hiding our true selves than I thought. He took another sip, maybe a little too good. I should have been paying closer attention to what you were building. I should have been your biggest cheerleader years ago. You saw what mattered, I assured him. You were reading those quarterly tech reports, weren't you? He smiled. It started as professional curiosity. Then it just became a matter of pure pride in what you were achieving. But I knew you had to do it on your own terms. I didn't want to interfere. And I appreciate that more than you could possibly know, I said. And I meant every word. It was everything to build this my own way. My father's expression turned serious. That pen. It really was one of Arthur's. I nodded, holding up my hand so he could see it better in the dim light. He gave it to me when I turned 21. He said it signed the deals that built his empire, and now it was my turn to use it. My father examined it like a jeweler, admiring the classic design and worn silver clip. I heard rumors about his personal collection, but you never see any of it for sale. He gave every single piece away to people he believed in. Nothing was ever auctioned. I told him Arthur said he sketched his first designs with it for 3 solid years before he ever sold a thing. He claimed it taught him patience and focus, the two things that made his entire career. Clearly, my father said, his eyes moving from the pen to mine. And now they're making yours. Our quiet moment was broken by my cousin Mark, who walked over looking less arrogant than I'd ever seen him. Excuse me, Uncle Robert, could I borrow Chloe for a moment? My father looked at me, and I gave him a small nod. Of course. I should probably go find your mother anyway. She's likely trying to secure a donation for the new symphony hall now that she knows you can afford it. He gave me a quick wink and walked away. Mark sank into the empty chair, his earlier swagger completely gone. I owe you an apology, Chloe. My attitude tonight, and for the last few years to be honest, has been completely out of bounds. I just watched him, trying to gauge if this was real. Apology accepted. But let me ask you something. What exactly are you apologizing for? He seemed surprised by the question. For the cheap shots. For all the jokes about your tiny apartment, your job, everything. And if my company was only worth $20,000 instead of $2 billion. Would you be sitting here right now? I asked. To his credit, Mark actually looked embarrassed. That's a fair question. It's the only question that matters, I told him. Because if you're only sorry now that I'm successful, you haven't really learned a thing. He sat in silence for a long time, actually thinking about it. You're right, he finally said. I've been using the wrong criteria to judge people, myself included. It's the way I was raised, but that's no excuse. It's never too late to change your perspective, I said, my tone softening. Arthur was almost 50 when he finally figured out his own relationship with money. It changed his entire life. I'd like to hear about him sometime, if you're ever willing to share, Mark said. I'd like that, I replied, genuinely surprised. Just then, my mother swept in, her face a perfect picture of theatrical panic. Chloe, darling, I feel just dreadful about all those comments about your rusty car, your small apartment, your whole life. She sat down, grabbing both of my hands. If I had any idea what you were working on, Mom, I cut in gently. That's exactly why I never told you. I needed you to love my life for what it was, not for what it was worth. She stared at me, looking confused. But we just want the best for you. It was heartbreaking to see you struggling when we could have helped. This is what I want, I explained. A robotics company that's solving urban food shortages. A foundation that funds young engineers. A life built on purpose, not on price tag. But you can have it all, she insisted. A life of purpose and beautiful things. I looked down at the pen from Arthur. I already do. This is the most valuable object I will ever own. Not because of what it's worth, but because of the man who gave it to me. And that's how I feel about my work and my friends. My mother sighed, clearly not understanding. Well, at the very least, you have to let me find you a decent condo, somewhere with a proper concierge. I had to laugh. Some things just never change. I love you, Mom, even when you're trying to stage a hostile takeover of my zip code. She finally smiled back. And I love you, even when you refuse to wear a perfectly lovely Chanel suit. As the gala wound down, I realized I'd had more real conversations tonight than in the past 10 years of holidays combined. Some of my relatives were obviously still in shock, their whole perception of me completely shattered. A few others looked like they were suddenly questioning their own definitions of success. And a small number, like my father, were actually seizing me for the first time, looking past the quiet girl and the shocking news to the woman I had fought to become. When it was finally time to go, I called for a car, politely declining several offers for a ride. My father walked with me to the massive front doors to wait. You gave everyone a lot to think about tonight, he said. Especially me. That was never the intention. I promise, I told him. I just wanted them to see me for me, not as a pet project or some lucky fluke. He nodded thoughtfully. Arthur's real legacy isn't the company or the patents, is it? It's how he taught people to see what truly matters. He put a hand on my shoulder. I would love to see your facility, meet your people, see what you're really building. I would love that, I said, a wide smile spreading across my face. How about next Tuesday? I can show you our new prototypes and you can meet the whole team. It's a date, he said just as my car pulled up. And, Chloe, don't you ever put that pen away. It's right where it belongs. Getting into the car, I looked at the pen, thinking about how some things and some people hold secrets you'd never guess. To most of my family, this pen meant I was suddenly a business prodigy. But for me, it was my connection to the man who proved that value isn't something you acquire, it's something you create. 3 weeks after that insane family gala, I was in my office overlooking the Boston Harbor. The space was sleek and functional reclaimed wood, walls of glass, and big collaborative tables. No expensive art, just framed pictures of our automated farms feeding local communities. My father's visit had gone better than I ever could have imagined. He arrived early for the tour, met my lead engineers, and asked incredibly sharp questions about our automation software and our crop yield data. I was so proud watching him talk with my head of robotics, completely engrossed in the schematics they were reviewing. Before he left, he was exchanging numbers with my chief's scientist, already planning introductions to his own network. "You've made something important here," he said as we stood on the balcony overlooking the city. "It's not just the technology, it's the mission. Your team actually believes in what they're doing." I just smiled and said that was the whole to build something that mattered. Looking at the architectural plans for our foundation's new research center, I realized how much had changed in just one night. My day-to-day life was the same, but my place in my family felt like it had been completely redrawn. My father and I started talking several times a week about science, philanthropy, and even the history of microscope optics, a shared interest we never knew we had. My mother stopped sending me links to penthouse condos and started sending cashmere socks instead. But the biggest shock was Leo. He actually called me last week and asked if I could tell him more about Arthur's philosophy. My mother and I started meeting for lunch, and I was floored by how much she'd changed. She'd started volunteering to clean up a local river, finding a passion for environmental work that honestly shocked everyone. Our whole family dynamic was shifting. At a recent fundraise, she was talking about conservation, not just her social calendar. It felt like a new beginning. A soft knock on my lab door snapped me back to the present. "Your 3 o'clock is here," my assistant said. "The urban garden applicant." "Send him in," I replied, standing up to meet him. Leo walked in, looking young but determined, clutching a folder. He was applying for our Startup as Community grant with this amazing plan to bring a derelict industrial lot back to life. "Miss Montgomery," he started, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "Thank you for your time." "Please, call me Clara," I said, motioning toward a chair. "Leo, your proposal blew me away. Your idea to use mycelium to clean up the contaminated soil is just brilliant." A huge grin spread across his face. "I grew up near that lot," he explained. "I know what that kind of pollution does to a neighborhood. I want to build something that heals the land and the community." As he walked me through his step-by-step plan, his passion was just contagious. He really reminded me of myself when I was just starting out, with huge ideas and even bigger hurdles to jump. This was exactly the kind of person my mentor Elias Vance always looked for: a builder. Someone driven to make a real positive change. "How would you feel if my company didn't just fund this, but partnered with you?" I asked. "You'd get full access to our biochemists and our lab to perfect your soil treatments." His jaw literally dropped. "Are you serious?" "That would change everything." "I'm dead serious," I told him. "This project needs to happen." With our lab's help, his urban garden could feed hundreds of families. As we started mapping out the project, I glanced at the Van sculpture on my shelf, a little reminder of the responsibility that comes with success. Helping Leo felt like the perfect way to honor Elias's legacy by investing in a better future. After Leo left, absolutely buzzing with excitement, I called my mother Eleanor to tell her the news. She listened quietly and then said something that completely stunned me. "I want to help," she said. "Not with money, I want to be there, on the ground, helping organize. I know my way around City Hall, and I know how to get volunteers," she offered. "Eleanor, that's amazing," I said, truly moved. "The project could absolutely use your expertise, and I could use a dose of that youthful idealism," she replied with a laugh. "Clara, that night at dinner, it wasn't just about the sculpture. It made me look at what I really value. I want my legacy to be more than just a name on some plaque." As we talked about her role, I was just amazed at how one conversation could set off such a massive change. Choosing to live by my mentor's philosophy wasn't just changing me, it was changing my entire family. That night, walking through a park downtown, I watched the city's different faces pass by. A chef heading home, a tired-looking doctor, students laughing, a banker in a suit just like my brother's, every single one with their own story, their own idea of a good life. Elias Vance saw the world that way. He saw potential in people, not their job titles. He cared more about creativity than cash. Back in my apartment, I touched the cool bronze of his sculpture. It was so much more than a piece of art. It was my moral compass, guiding me and reminding me that real wealth isn't what you have, but what you will build. It was about purpose, not public perception. This sculpture wasn't some investment to be locked away in a safe. It would stay right here on my mantle, a season's partner in every meeting, every family dinner, every quiet evening. It would measure my life the same way it measured my mentors. Steady growth of something good in the world. As I was getting ready for bed, a text from Eleanor lit up my phone. She just left her first volunteer meeting, buzzing with energy. I finally get what Elias was about, she wrote. Creation over consumption. Thank you for showing me what it means to be truly wealthy. I smiled and texted back that connection and purpose are the only currencies that really count. Sure, the sculpture might have started that awkward family dinner, but it was the idea behind it that really changed us all. The idea that our value comes from what we give, not what we own. Has a special object ever helped you find your own sense of purpose? Or has someone finally understood you after they saw what you were passionate about? Share your own story in the comments below. If this story about what success really means resonated with you, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding true value in a world that's obsessed with price. And always remember, the most valuable things in our lives aren't measured by what they cost, but by the meaning we give them. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I hope you never forget your own incredible worth, something that no amount of money could ever buy.